Thank you very much for the great honor to be able to share with you perspectives on resilience from the Confucian literature. From the very beginning of time, humans have been fascinated with how individuals overcome hardship, beat the odds, and are able to contribute to society. We see these tales of resilience throughout the epics, the classics, and other forms of literature around the world. But actually, the scientific study of resilience only began in the 1960s. And I'm talking about individual psychological resilience. The first studies looked at children from disadvantaged backgrounds. So, for example, refugees, and how these children were able to achieve normal, if not above average, development. And by the 1990s, it was very clear that it wasn't because these children had an unusual gift or extraordinary talent, but actually it was because of what they called ordinary magic, things that they did in their everyday lives, their thoughts, their emotions, emotional regulation, how they related with others. It was these very ordinary things that helped them, as well as their environment, their family, people around them, and including their culture. So, hence the idea that it was resilience comes from us. We all have the power to develop our resilience. It's not just the few special individuals. And that raised a lot of interest as to how we develop resilience. And now, of course, resilience is being researched across, as you can see here, many medical sciences, the social sciences, and education, of course, which is very exciting because the more we find out about resilience in various fields, the better the society, education, including these ideas of resilience, can be. But there is a problem in the research, which is that the definition of resilience remains debated. So you have so many different scholars across different fields talking about this idea, but they talk about it very differently. And even within the field of psychology, there's still debate about exactly what resilience but what's the definition of resilience? Scholars, of course, will generally agree that there are different types. So let's say, for example, if we look at this model, you can see here A, B, C, D. Let's take them as four different individuals and how they develop over time, which is the horizontal axis. You can see, first of all, person A, they are developing fine. They're very stable. And despite whatever happens to them, it's as if they are unaffected. They will continue to develop. And that's A. Let's look at B. So what happens with the line in B is that there's this downward slope, which shows that they've encountered some sort of difficulty, this adversity. But over a period of time, they come back, they resume normal functioning. And that's in contrast to C, so rather D. This person D, not only resumes normal function, but they actually grow and develop and do better than before. So already in this graph, you can see there are different models of resilience, and which of these models you decide is resilience will be how you do your research and will affect your findings. So that becomes a problem when we try to interrogate and look at the studies. But generally, of course, scholars will agree that there's two key criteria when it comes to defining or understanding this phenomena of resilience in individuals. The first one is that there needs to be a presence of some sort of difficulty. So, of course, many people will agree that we cannot be resilient if we have never encountered any form of difficulty. So there has to be some sort of adversity. And the different types. So externally, based on the environment, it could be that we are in a country or an area facing natural or man-made disaster. It could be related to our community or our family, so sense of poverty or even neglect, or even on an internal individual level, such as individuals suffering from chronic illness. So all of these can quite clearly be considered difficulties. Other scholars will also say that perhaps even ordinary life events, like the loss of a loved one, or daily stresses such as work pressures, can also be considered as adversity in this criteria for resilience, and therefore you can see very quickly that there's already this huge scope from life-threatening adversities to sort of daily stress. So that's the first criteria. The second criteria is that after you experience or encounter this adversity, you adapt positively. So generally, it's described as not experiencing any psychological disorder. So, for example, depression or mental health problems, but also functional competence. So, in your daily life. Now, if we're talking about children, it would be looking at developmental milestones. If we're talking about adults, it could be their work, their relationships. So these are the kinds of ideas that relate to sort of positive adaptation. And already you can see that even though we're talking about a modern psychological concept of resilience, in fact, the two criteria of adversity and adaptation can be applied to ancient China, which is where we're going to be focusing on today in terms of the Confucian tradition. That you will be able to find adversity and also ideas of adaptation in the ancient literature. So when we think about Chinese culture in general, we will see that resilience is very prevalent in the culture, the so-called three friends of winter. So winter being a metaphor for hardship, difficult times. And the three friends are pictured here, bamboo, pine, and a plum blossom. And their characteristics are meant to inspire us to be also resilient like them. So bamboo and pine, they remain green throughout the year. They are evergreen. And particularly through the harsh winter, they it's almost like they're withstanding the cold. On top of that, for bamboo, it's flexible. So in the wind and storm, bamboo will bend, but it won't break. So that shows again this toughness. But what's really special about the plum blossom is that not only does it endure the cold, but actually in the late winter, the coldest period, is actually when plum blossoms will flower. So that's when you see the blossoms. Its nature is that it inspires us to think about flourishing, really growing and developing during the very hard times in our life. So these so-called friends of winter are found in Chinese material culture and art, in literature, and it shows the inspiration that's resonated throughout very many generations of Chinese scholars and artists. And of course, even in the Chinese language, you'll find idioms that relate to resilience. So generally, of course, we can see that in the Chinese culture, this modern psychological concept of resilience is present. Now, and of course, the Chinese culture, one of the key influences is the Confucian tradition. So I'm going to be drawing a lot on Confucius his students and other Confucian scholars to bring out these ideas of resilience. I want to focus first on Confucius himself as a exemplary model of resilience. Now we know Confucius, in terms of his teachings, had a number of things to say that directly related to resilience, but probably even more impactful is not what he said, but what he did and his personal example that has inspired so many. So Confucius had a tough life. Um, After he was born, his father passed away, and he was raised by a single parent, his mum. And actually, his mother passed away in his teenage years, so he became an orphan from quite an early age. And as a result, he had to fend for himself. And for his livelihood, he tells us he had to work a lot of odd jobs. So here he's depicted as a keeper of the granary. He was also a keeper of livestock, but learning these different skills to get by in life. So it was really tough for Confucius, even from a very early age. But actually, there was even greater hardships to come. We know of his legendary journey across uh, uh, almost all of the Chinese kingdom at the time, as you can see from his various travels marked by the red arrows on this map. So Confucius in his 50s left his home state of Lu and embarked on a journey around the various states of China in efforts to realize his ethical and political vision to help the people to improve the quality of life of the people who are facing, civil disorder as well as very frequent interstate wars. So through these travels, we can imagine, travel today, but travel over 2,000 years ago, in the 6th century BCE, was difficult. And Confucius, as well as his accompanying students, often faced danger, threats, even confronted death. And, on a psychological level, continued disappointment. Um, you can see from where they traveled and why they traveled was because state leaders were either indifferent or rejected this vision of Confucius's ideas. And ultimately, Confucius, towards the end of his life, his later years, he returns to his home state of Lu, with his dream being unrealized, and spends the last years of his life teaching. And so Confucius had experienced setback after setback and many hardships. I want to focus on a particular, very famous story about Confucius, his troubles between the states of Qin and Cai. And this story is well recorded. It's recorded in about 10 different texts of early Chinese texts, as I've listed here, in varying details. And I'm going to draw from these to take you through what happened in this episode of his life. So, Chen and Cai refers to these states here in the yellow circle. So he was traveling between these states on the way to the state of Chu, CHU, at the bottom. But unfortunately, the state leaders of Chen and Cai wanted to stop Confucius from heading to the larger state because they were afraid of him providing good political council and the state of Chu becoming even more powerful. So they besieged Confucius uh, on the road, and as a result, Confucius, as it says here, he ran out of food. Right? And according to even other excerpts from the other texts, for 7 days, they didn't have any rice, any grain, what we call food staples. carbohydrates. Uh, they only drank soup, so water with the wild vegetables they could find. So everyone, all everyone was following him. These students accompanying him were completely starved, and to the extent that they had such little energy, they couldn't even stand up. And yet, we read here, Confucius continued to be playing on his zither and singing without, as if nothing was happening, nothing happened, without ceasing. He is completely at ease. But what is everyone else thinking? You know, the people who were around him, who followed him, also starving. Well, we get a sense of this in Master Zhuang, this text, uh, where the different students, Zigong, Zilu, and others, they're discussing, all of the different setbacks that they've already faced along with Confucius. For example, when they were in the state of Song, Confucius was lecturing under a tree, and someone tried to kill Confucius by trying to chop down that tree. And all these other things that happen. And now look at us. We're on our way, and yet our food has run out. And they're also quite disillusioned because Confucius doesn't have any sort of clear political status. He's not a citizen of any of these states, which means that they don't have to protect him. They don't offer any protection. And yet, they're very surprised that despite all of these frustrations, Confucius can still be so happy that he is still strumming on his lute, playing music and singing. So they're thinking, well, a noble person. So this is a concept in Confucian thought of a person who is cultivating their noble character, embarking on the Confucian learning. So can a noble person be like this? Not be ashamed that nothing they failed in some way on their mission. And so one of these students, his name's Zilu, who happens to be one of the oldest, and he is just 9 years younger than Confucius. So oftentimes we see he's the one who speaks out, very speaks his mind, because he's one of the more senior students. Almost sees Confucius as a friend, and so he comes out and says to Confucius, you know, you're playing music. Is this the right thing to do right now? And Confucius hears him but doesn't immediately respond. He continues playing until he finishes that tune on his that piece, before he says, he turns to Zilu and tells him. So he says, well, he cites three, as you can see, three key individuals at the time. And he says these three individuals, they all underwent hardship. And it was during the time that they encountered this difficulty that they thought of making a change, that their emotions were stirred. They wanted to change the status quo and make a difference. And that's what led to their later success and prominence. So all of these three were very prominent political figures at that time, in ancient China. And so they had to go through this first. So this is what Confucius is saying. And he continues by saying, if you do not suffer, if no one knows you, no one believes in you, it's when you hit that rock bottom that you pull yourself out and you grow stronger, and your thoughts are able to reach far in terms of being able to think about, well, how can I change so that perhaps my goals or things that I'm doing, so that planning ahead, perhaps the road I'm taking, there's something that needs to be changed there about myself as well. And then it's only when you're restricted that you become really creative. You draw on all of your resources to think more broadly. So this idea of wisdom in life. It says, how do you know that right here, right now, is not that time for us, that it's our opportunity to be greater, to reach our potential, drawing on our resources. This is the time for us. And he says this. So this is exactly what he's thinking. And he says this, he gets up, and the following day, the forces that had been surrounding them left. Okay, so uh, then they carry on their journey. One of the more senior students, also called Zigong, he's driving, and he tells the younger, more junior students, okay, everyone, let's not forget what happened to us here in between Chen and Cai, and these difficult days that we spent here, so that we will always, really appreciate opportunities, right? So this is what he's saying. But Confucius, when he hears Zigong, immediately refutes him. He says, why would you say that? These days are not difficulties. It's our good fortune. It's a blessing for us. And that's exactly how Confucius was thinking all of this time. He uses this proverb here, break your arm 3 times before you can become a good doctor. And it's actually it's from the Zhuo tradition, but it was a proverb at the time. And what it means is that if you encounter a problem, the same problem, time and time again, well, by the third time, you're going to be quite familiar with how to solve that problem. So just like if you have an illness, and you're probably very familiar with all the treatments and the management, and you will become very clear about that for that problem. So in fact, uh, that problem is a blessing for you because you learn and you develop. So afterwards, it's no longer a problem. And so Confucius is saying that for him, these days were such provided that opportunity to grow and to really develop. And he continues by saying, I've heard that rulers cannot become kings. So kings are, the term for someone who rules over the entire kingdom and not just one of those states. So into the entire sort of map that we saw just then. So leaders cannot become, kings without enduring this hardship. And the so-called men of service, so great ministers, can also not become noble, of noble character, and be distinguished if they don't endure hardship so that they can really improve themselves. And then he continues by talking about just, a few of these key figures in the history of China, ancient China, who were 2 kings and 4 overlords or hegemons that we might call. So leaders of certain domains that actually achieved great power over the entire Chinese kingdom. And all of these people met with difficulties, and they had to overcome their difficulties. And it was through overcoming their difficulties that they ultimately became great. So for Confucius, this idea of Chen, his struggles here were not difficulties, but they were opportunities. So in another text that records the same episode, there's this line that Confucius says in response to Zugong. So not only does he say there's a blessing, but he also uses the analogy of the pine and the cypress. So it's only when the thick winter comes, so when there's thick snow, that you really see the pine and the cypress, their leaves are still there and they're still green. And this is, you might have been more familiar with the line in the Analects. So it's also a line in the Analects which talks about how the pine and the cypress are the last to lose their leaves, and that's when we know that they are evergreens, right? So ancient commentators, in terms of this passage, have noted that what is Confucius saying? He's saying that in the rest of the 3 seasons of the year, all of the trees look the same. right? They've all got leaves on them, in the sense of look, they've all got leaves on them. Um, but it's only when it comes to winter that the evergreens, the pine and the cypress, we see that they last, and they'll be starkly different from the deciduous trees, which are completely bare. And this is used as an analogy for the noble person, the person of noble character, versus the petty person, the person who's uncultivated, who cannot last. So in favorable conditions, circumstances, everyone thinks the same, talks the same, does the same things, because the times are good. But it's only when the times are tough that you will see who is the true noble person, uh, the who is of noble character. That's when they reveal themselves, because what they say, what they think, and what they do will be completely different from the other people who may not be cultivated. So this is the analogy here, that to inspire us to be like the pine and the cypress and have this resilience, but to also see the hardship as an opportunity for us to shine. And it brings me back to what Confucius said, that actually it's a blessing for him. And reading that and reflecting on, why would he say that? It made me think of the idea that for him, Confucius, this hardship, starvation and near death, was actually a test for him to really test and evaluate his own cultivation in the same way that we see athletes, they train every day. It's only when they're in the competition that they test themselves to see whether or not they can beat their personal best or whether they can beat the world record. So it's only in that the heat and the stress of the competitions that they can see that, and they welcome the competition. They don't shy away from it. That's when they become the champion. So for Confucius, this is an opportunity for him, not just to learn, but to test himself, like these trees, the evergreen trees. Mencius, we know, who lived 100 years after Confucius, but very key Confucian in the early Chinese period, takes us a step further and tells us that hardship or this adversity should be considered a necessity. If we are destined for great things, then we will have to encounter difficulty. And to the extent that it's not just about, perhaps physical difficulties, but even psychological difficulties. Like, everything that we do fails, no one believes in us. And this kind of this kind of experience reminds me of the biographies of great inventors or scientists or Nobel Peace Prize winners, that before they achieved their success, there were years perhaps of failure and frustration. But it's through that frustration that they grow this toughness, that they reflect more on what they're doing, what they can improve in their work, but in themselves. And as it says here, it's through this that their mind becomes more stimulated, their nature strengthened, and they improve on their weaknesses. So they get to see their weaknesses. They face to face with their weaknesses. And even though it's very difficult to do that, by overcoming that, they grow. And therefore, Mencius continues by saying that in the absence of hardship, let's say that you're a state leader and you don't have councils or ministers who will challenge you, question your judgment, give you a different, an opposing opinion. Well, what's going to happen? Well, the state leader will become complacent. Everyone's approving, everyone just praises them. Then they will perish. That state will be threatened and ultimately collapse. So we see this a lot in the historical records. But as an individual, if we don't experience this hardship, Mencius is saying that we also will face difficulty. It will be dangerous. So in other words, a lack of hardship is the true danger for us, because psychologically we become complacent. So the idea is that from all of these excerpts, uh, the the central point is that adversity can be reappraised. So rethinking adversity, that it's not just an obstacle for us, some sort of bad luck, but it's an opportunity to help us to see further, to see differently, to improve ourselves. It's a time uh, that's given to us to reflect. And then ultimately, as Confucius would say, even a test. We should welcome these tests so we can see where it is that we really need to work hard. And as Mensch says, it's training for us. If we want to do great things, we need this training. But it's only temporary because after we get to that level, then we will be ready. So in fact, adversity is should be welcomed rather than thinking of it as negatively, which will help us be more resilient. So that's the first sort of criteria, that idea of adversity. And hopefully from some of these excerpts, you'll see that the way Confucius looks at it might be different, and will help us in terms of resilience. But I want to now go to the second idea of what is positive adaptation in terms of the Confucian context. So I said before that adaptation in modern psychology would be sort of a functional competence and lack of psychological disorder. But for Confucius, that's not enough. These are not sufficient conditions for positive adaptation. For positive adaptation, for Confucius would say, we would also need to have our thoughts, our emotions, and our actions oriented towards a sense of moral progress or moral development. And so we see here, Confucius says, the noble person, the person who's developing their noble character, will devote their thoughts to the way, and not food, which represents external goods. Now, that's not to say the external goods are and thoughts of the way are mutually exclusive, but the thoughts should be directed or focused on the way, and the external goods, salary, position, etc., will be attained on the way, rather than that being the goal. So, for Confucius, the positive adaptation is that we continue to make progress on this journey towards attaining the way. And you might say, well, this is a big concept. It's a key concept here. What is the way? It is really the aim of Confucian learning. So Xingzhong Yao, in his text about knowledge and wisdom, talks about how in the Confucian learning, but generally in Chinese philosophy, this idea of knowledge and wisdom, the aim of that, what's the aim of all the learning is the ultimate reality, also known as the Tian or heaven, Ming, or more popularly, the way or the Dao. And this way, so to speak, is not outside of us, but it's actually within us. It's about evaluating our thoughts, our emotions, our desires, so that it's aligned with the ancient sages, because these sages were the embodiment of the way, that they have realized the way, they've achieved the way. What did they do, and how can we be more like them? So that's the idea there, is to look within, to focus on things that we can control, which is our own thoughts and our emotions and the way we interact with others. And that's exactly the kind of advice that Confucius gives when another one of his students, called Sima, is experiencing a lot of uncertainty and fear. So the background to this story is that Sima, his brother, is planning a rebellion and in another state. And if that fails, then not only would his brother, but also his family would be implicated and possibly executed. So Sima is very concerned. He's paralyzed with the sense of fear. And it's in this context that he asks Confucius, how would the noble person, a person of noble character, respond in this situation? But he doesn't really understand what Confucius is saying. How can I not have fear or worries right now uh, when this is about to happen, right? My family is about to be executed, perhaps. And Confucius says, well, focus within. So focus on examining oneself, your thoughts and your emotions, and how evaluate it according to the standards of the exemplars and how they did. And if you've obviously if you fall short of the exemplars, the stages, then you should be proactive and do more. But if you've done everything that they would have done, then you wouldn't have nothing to feel guilty about. And no one else can blame you. And you wouldn't be able to blame yourself because you've done your best. So in these uncertain times, uh, rather than focusing on things that you can't control, like your brother or his criminal activity, you should focus on what you can control, which is your own thoughts, your own emotions, and how you might respond better and to others right here in the present. So in that way, if you're able to work on that, you wouldn't have anything to fear and you wouldn't have anything to worry about. So Confucius is very much asking you to look within. And that comes up again and again in his own life. We know, of course, as we said before, that throughout his life, he never really achieved the government position that he wanted, the influence to be able to help society. And yet, as you can see from what he says here, he was not concerned with the position at all. He tells us to be concerned about our own abilities. So how we can be qualified for that position. And this is reiterated throughout the Analects. Be concerned, not at, don't blame others for not recognizing you. Don't blame the conditions, but look within. Focus on yourself, your own thoughts, your emotions, your own conduct, and how you can grow, how you can develop your own abilities so that you will be employable. There's also a really famous metaphor that's used, which is that of an archer. So it comes up, as you can see from these two excerpts. But the idea is that if you are an archer and you miss the mark, you don't hit the target, you can't blame your competitors, or you can't blame that the target was too far away. The only thing you can do is really think about when you release the arrow, what was your arm like? Where were you looking at? What were you looking at? So the point is to reflect on yourself, to turn within and seek within yourself as to what may be the problem and improve on these aspects. So this very much resonates with a modern psychological concept of an internal locus of control. So the internal locus of control, as you can see, is the idea that you feel that you can, your efforts are important in your future. So what you do right now will help with what happens later in your life. It has an influence. It may not be immediately possible, but you can make changes. You have control. So this is an internal locus of control. In contrast, an external locus of control is when you feel that the control is not within you, but is on some external factor like God, luck, fate, other people perhaps, and therefore you feel helpless. And this was a very early finding in the resilience literature, that if you had this internal locus of control, you were more resilient. You had less you didn't have coping problems. Whereas the external locus of control is that of you feel that you don't have the control in your life. Okay, so that's the idea. Resilience and this internal locus of control go hand in hand. I want to finish up with these slides that the ancients, so where are our thoughts directed? and they should be directed towards the idea of the way. Is our life lived in accordance with the ideas of the exemplary models of the sages? And if it is, then we're happy wherever we are. And in fact, success is achieved along the way. So whether you have success or failure. And similarly, I'll end with this passage from the Practice of the Mean, which says that the noble person acts accordingly without demanding of others. And whether in wealth and honor, whether they're poor, wherever they are in the world, even if they're encountering hardship, they are always at ease, just as we saw with Confucius himself. So I end my short this presentation, and I hope this has given you some food for thought on being more resilient in the hardships that you face in your life. Thank you very much for your kind attention.